The siege at dawn. Jack Morrison woke to a sound that didn't belong in the Montana wilderness. Not the elk bugling in the distance, not the wind through the pines, but the deep, mechanical thrum of helicopter rotors cutting through the pre-dawn silence. His eyes snapped open, heart already racing with that primal instinct that something was terribly wrong. He stumbled to the bedroom window of his ranch house and pulled back the curtain, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Black SUVs, dozens of them, forming a perimeter around his property, like a noose tightening around prey. Men in tactical gear moved with military precision across his 300 acres, weapons drawn, faces hidden behind dark visors. 2 helicopters circled overhead, searchlights sweeping across his land in broad, methodical arcs. The morning sun was just breaking over the Rockies, casting long shadows that made the scene feel even more surreal, like something from a dystopian film rather than his quiet corner near Glacier National Park. Jack's mind reeled. What the hell was happening? Had he somehow stumbled into a drug operation without knowing? Was this about unpaid property taxes? None of it made sense. He was just a 52-year-old widowed rancher who kept to himself, who wanted nothing more than to live out his days in the peace and isolation he'd chosen after Sarah died. But this federal siege, this overwhelming show of force, it all started 24 hours ago. It started with a simple act of kindness that Jack thought would remain his secret forever. The previous evening had been unremarkable until it wasn't. Jack had been finishing his nightly rounds, checking the fence lines and water sources that sustained his small herd of cattle. The isolation of his ranch had been a deliberate choice after Sarah's death 3 years ago. Cancer had taken her slowly, painfully, and when she finally slipped away, Jack had retreated from the world. He'd left his position as a wildlife biologist with the Park Service, cashed in his retirement, and bought this remote property where human voices were rare, and the only company came from ravens and wind. He'd been walking back toward the house, flashlight cutting through the gathering darkness when he heard it. A sound that stopped him mid-stride. Not quite a groan, not quite a growl, but something in between. Something that carried pain and exhaustion in equal measure. His biologist instincts kicked in before his common sense could protest, and he turned toward the creek that ran through the eastern section of his property. The beam of his flashlight found it before his mind could process what he was seeing. At first, Jack thought it was a bear. Had to be a bear. Except bears didn't stand 8 feet tall on 2 legs with that kind of posture. Bears didn't have hands that looked disturbingly human, with elongated fingers that gripped a tree trunk for support. Bears didn't have eyes that reflected the flashlight with an intelligence that made Jack's breath catch in his throat. The creature was massive, covered in reddish-brown hair that was matted with mud and blood. A deep gash ran down its left leg, the wound still seeping, and the creature's breathing came in labored gasps. For a long moment, man and creature simply stared at each other across the 20 feet of distance that separated them. Jack's scientific mind cataloged details automatically. Bipedal, primate characteristics, estimated weight 400 pounds. But it was the eyes that held him frozen. They weren't animal eyes. They showed fear, yes, but also calculation, awareness, and something that looked almost like resignation. This was real. After decades of rumors, blurry photographs, and dismissed sightings, Jack Morrison was standing 15 yards away from a Bigfoot, a Sasquatch, a creature that science claimed didn't exist, bleeding and vulnerable on his property. Every rational instinct screamed at Jack to run, to get back to the house, to call someone. But call who? And say what? More importantly, the creature was injured, suffering, and despite the fear coursing him through his veins, Jack couldn't ignore that. Sarah used to say his greatest strength and biggest weakness was the same thing. He couldn't turn away from something in pain. Jack forced himself to breathe slowly, to think like the biologist he'd trained to be. The creature hadn't attacked. It hadn't charged or threatened. It was just standing there, exhausted and hurt, watching him with those impossibly intelligent eyes. Making a decision that would change everything, Jack lowered his flashlight slightly, reducing the glare. He held up his free hand, palm out, in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "Easy," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not going to hurt you." The creature's head tilted slightly, a gesture so human it sent chills down Jack's spine. For several heartbeats, neither moved. Then, slowly, deliberately, Jack began backing toward his barn. He kept his movements smooth and non-threatening, maintaining eye contact until he reached the structure. Inside, he grabbed a large bucket and filled it with fresh water from the pump. His hands were shaking so badly, he spilled half of it on the ground. When he returned to the creek, the creature was still there, now sitting heavily against the tree trunk, the injured leg extended awkwardly. Jack approached with the bucket, each step an act of faith and terror combined. He stopped 10 feet away and carefully set the bucket down, then retreated several paces. The creature watched him with unblinking focus, its chest heaving with each labored breath. Jack stood motionless, his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited to see what would happen next. The night air felt electric with tension, every cricket and tree frog suddenly silent, as if nature itself held its breath. After what felt like an eternity, the Bigfoot leaned forward. The movement was cautious, deliberate, and Jack could see the pain that flashed across its face with each shift of weight. Using one massive arm for support, the creature reached toward the bucket, its hand hovering over the water for just a moment before dipping inside. When it brought cupped handfuls to its mouth, drinking deeply, Jack felt something shift inside his chest. This wasn't a monster. This was a living being, suffering and thirsty, responding to kindness with trust. Jack's scientific training kicked into overdrive as he observed every detail. The hands were remarkable, with an opposable thumb and fingers that showed dexterity no ape possessed. The facial structure blended human and primate characteristics in ways that shouldn't be possible according to everything he'd learned in graduate school. But it was the expressions that truly astounded him. As the creature drank, its features showed unmistakable relief. When it looked back at Jack, there was something in those dark eyes that transcended species, a recognition of one intelligent being acknowledging another. The wound on its leg was worse than Jack had initially thought. Even from his safe distance, he could see the gash was deep, possibly from a trap or barbed wire. The edges looked ragged, and the surrounding tissue was inflamed. Left untreated, infection would set in if it hadn't already. Jack's mind raced through a fierce internal debate. Every instinct, as a former wildlife biologist, screamed that this was the discovery of the century, something that should be documented, reported, studied. This creature could rewrite evolutionary biology, settle one of the greatest mysteries in cryptozoology, make his name legendary in scientific circles. But another voice, quieter but more insistent, reminded him of what happened to rare discoveries. The media circus, the government intervention. The creature would become a specimen, a curiosity, trapped in some facility for endless testing. Jack thought of the mountain gorillas he'd studied in his youth, how human contact and attention had nearly destroyed them. He thought of Sarah, who'd always believed some things were more important than career advancement or scientific glory. She'd chosen to live out here in isolation with him, away from the academic world that had disappointed them both with its politics and compromises. Looking at this magnificent creature drinking from his bucket, Jack made a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. He wouldn't tell anyone. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Moving slowly, Jack raised both hands again in that peaceful gesture. The Bigfoot watched him, but didn't retreat as Jack began backing toward the house. Inside, his hands still trembling with adrenaline, Jack gathered supplies. First aid kit, antibiotics meant for livestock, clean towels. Then he raided his kitchen, filling a canvas bag with everything he could think of. Apples, carrots, leftover venison jerky, a loaf of bread, dried berries he'd collected last autumn. He had no idea what this creature ate, but he'd cover all possibilities. The walk back to the creek felt surreal, like moving through a dream where normal rules didn't apply. Part of Jack expected to find nothing there, to discover this had been some exhaustion-induced hallucination. But the Bigfoot remained, still leaning against the tree, the empty bucket beside it. When it saw Jack approaching with his supplies, something changed in its posture. The wariness didn't disappear, but it lessened, replaced by what Jack could only interpret as cautious hope. Jack set everything down about 8 feet away, farther than before, but still within the creature's reach. He unpacked slowly, narrating his actions in a soft, steady voice. The words didn't matter, he knew, but the tone did. He'd used this same approach with injured animals countless times, letting his voice become a tool of reassurance. The Bigfoot's eyes tracked every movement, that remarkable intelligence evident in how it assessed each item Jack produced. When Jack held up the antiseptic spray, the creature's nose wrinkled, catching the chemical scent. But it didn't flee. Instead, it extended its injured leg slightly, an invitation that made Jack's throat tighten with emotion. Understanding flowed between them without language. The creature knew Jack wanted to help. It was choosing to trust him. Jack sprayed the antiseptic from a distance, wincing sympathetically as the creature tensed against obvious pain. But it held still, allowing the treatment. And when Jack set down the bottle and backed away, the Bigfoot reached for the food. It examined each item carefully, sniffing and turning things over in those incredibly human-like hands. The apples disappeared first, consumed with obvious relish. Then the carrots, the jerky it studied longer before eating, and the bread it seemed to particularly enjoy. As the creature ate, Jack sat down on the ground, making himself smaller and less threatening. They remained like that for nearly an hour, man and Bigfoot, separated by a few feet and an evolutionary gulf that shouldn't have been bridgeable. Yet somehow, in the darkness beside a Montana creek, they'd found a way to connect. Jack talked quietly about his ranch, about Sarah, about the mountains they both called home. The creature listened, its eyes never leaving Jack's face. And though it couldn't possibly understand the words, Jack felt certain it grasped the meaning underneath them. Dawn began painting the eastern sky pale gray when the Bigfoot finally stirred. It rose with obvious effort, favoring the treated leg, and gathered the remaining food into the towel Jack had brought, tying it with a facility that proved its intelligence beyond doubt. Then it did something that would replay in Jack's mind for years to come. The creature looked directly at Jack, held his gaze for a long moment, and nodded. One slow, deliberate nod of acknowledgement and gratitude. The nod hung in the air between them like a sacred promise, and then the Bigfoot turned and limped into the forest. Jack watched until the massive form disappeared into the shadows between the pines, swallowed by the wilderness as completely as if it had never existed. He sat there as full dawn broke, bathing the creek in golden light, trying to process what had just happened. His hands trembled slightly as he gathered the empty bucket and medical supplies. The ground where the creature had sat showed clear impressions, proof that his exhausted mind hadn't conjured this encounter from grief and isolation. Walking back to the ranch house, Jack felt the weight of an impossible secret settling onto his shoulders. Who could he tell? Who would believe him? More importantly, who should know? His scientific training screamed at him to document everything, to contact colleagues, to report this discovery that would revolutionize primatology and anthropology. But a deeper instinct, the same one that had driven him to help rather than photograph, insisted that some things were more important than recognition. This creature had trusted him. That trust felt sacred, inviolable. Jack went through his morning chores on autopilot, feeding the horses and checking fence lines while his mind replayed every detail of the encounter. The intelligence in those eyes, the deliberate nod, the careful way those hands had handled objects. This wasn't just an undiscovered animal. This was another kind of person, another form of consciousness that had somehow survived in the margins of human civilization. The responsibility of that knowledge felt crushing. By mid-morning, Jack had almost convinced himself to simply carry on with normal life, to keep this secret locked away and hope the creature recovered safely in the wilderness. Then he heard it, a faint mechanical whine, high-pitched and persistent. He stepped out of the barn and scanned the sky, spotting a small drone hovering over his eastern pasture. Not the cheap recreational kind teenagers flew. This was sleek, professional, equipped with what looked like serious camera equipment. Jack's stomach dropped. Drones didn't just wander over his property. His ranch sat 20 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a rough private road he maintained himself. This was deliberate surveillance. But why? And by whom? He watched the drone make a systematic grid pattern over his land, clearly searching for something. After 15 minutes, it rose higher and buzzed away toward the south. The unease that had started as a whisper became a shout when Jack drove his truck toward the main road 2 hours later to check his mailbox. 3 miles from his house, where his private road met the county highway, he found them. Black SUVs. Not 1 or 2, but 7 of them, parked in a formation that blocked any exit. As Jack slowed his truck, men in tactical gear emerged from the vehicles. They wore no identifying insignia, no police badges, nothing that indicated what agency they represented. Jack's heart hammered against his ribs. This couldn't be about the Bigfoot. That was impossible. He'd told no one, documented nothing. Yet the timing felt too coincidental to ignore. He considered turning around, but armed men were already walking toward his truck with purposeful strides. Running would only make whatever this was infinitely worse. A woman stepped forward from the lead vehicle, her bearing suggesting command even before she spoke. She was perhaps 50, with steel gray hair pulled back severely, and eyes that missed nothing. Unlike the tactical team, she wore a dark business suit, though Jack noticed the slight bulge of a shoulder holster beneath her jacket. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Commander Patricia Hayes. We need to talk." Her voice carried authority that expected compliance rather than requesting it. Jack climbed out of his truck slowly, keeping his hands visible. Years of living alone had made him cautious around unexpected visitors, and these were about as unexpected as visitors could get. Talk about what? And who exactly are you people? Hayes studied him with an intensity that felt invasive, as if she could read his secrets in his posture. The words hit Jack like a physical blow. They knew. Somehow, impossibly they knew. His mind raced through possibilities. Had someone been watching his property? Had the creature been tagged? I don't know what you're talking about, he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Mr. Morrison, we don't have time for denials. Hayes gestured, and one of the tactical team members brought forward a tablet. She turned it toward Jack, showing thermal satellite imagery. The timestamp read, the previous night. 2 heat signatures glowed on the screen near what Jack recognized as his creek. One was human-sized, the other was massive, far larger than any bear or elk. This is your property. That's you. She pointed to the smaller signature. Care to explain what that is? Jack's mouth went dry. Satellites. They'd been watching from space. How long had they been tracking the creature? I want to know who you are and what authority you have to be on my land. Federal authority, Mr. Morrison. That's all you need to know right now. Hayes's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained hard. We're not here to cause you trouble, but we need information, and we need it immediately. The entity you encountered last night is of critical importance to national security. National security? Jack couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. It was injured. I gave it water. That's all. That's all? Hayes shook her head. Mr. Morrison, within the hour, this area will be flooded with personnel and equipment. Command center is already being established in your barn as we speak. You can cooperate voluntarily, or we can make this significantly more difficult for everyone involved. Your choice. Jack stood frozen as the reality of his situation crystallized with terrifying clarity. The woman before him wasn't bluffing. Through the windows of his own home, he could see figures moving inside, setting up equipment he didn't recognize. His sanctuary, the place where he'd retreated after Sarah's death to heal in solitude, had been transformed into some kind of military operation in a matter of hours. Hayes gestured toward his house. Shall we continue this conversation inside? Or would you prefer to stand out here while my team completes their setup? The walk to his porch felt surreal, like moving through someone else's nightmare. Jack noticed details that made his skin crawl. Cables running from generators to his barn. Satellite dishes being erected near his fence line. Men in hazmat suits examining the ground near the creek where the creature had been. This wasn't a simple investigation. This was a full-scale operation that had clearly been planned and mobilized with frightening efficiency. Inside, his kitchen table was covered with laptops and communication equipment. A younger agent, maybe 30, looked up as they entered. Commander, we've established secure uplink. Washington is standing by. Give us the room, Hayes ordered. The agents filed out, leaving Jack alone with her. She pulled out a chair and sat without invitation, gesturing for Jack to do the same in his own home. What I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. The fact that you're hearing this means you're already involved whether you want to be or not. Jack remained standing, arms crossed. I'm listening. Hayes opened a slim briefcase and withdrew a file folder. Inside were photographs that made Jack's breath catch. The creature from last night, captured in various images. Some were blurry trail camera shots, others were clearer, showing the same reddish-brown hair, the same massive build. But these photos were dated. Some went back years. The species you encountered has been known to certain government agencies since 1967, Hayes began. Not believed to exist. Not theorized. Known. Confirmed. Documented. There are approximately 273 individuals remaining in North America, concentrated in remote wilderness areas. They're classified as a protected species, under a program so black, it doesn't officially exist. Jack's legs felt weak. He sat down heavily. You're telling me the government has known about Bigfoot for over 50 years? We prefer the term indigenous cryptid hominid. But yes. Hayes pulled out another photo, this one showing the creature Jack had helped, but younger, healthier. This individual is designated ICH 247. Male, approximately 28 years old. One of only 43 breeding-age males left in the population. He's not just important, Mr. Morrison. He's critical to the survival of his entire species. The weight of what he was hearing pressed down on Jack. The wound. How did he get injured? Hayes's expression darkened. Poachers. Not the kind who want a trophy. The kind who want a living specimen to sell to the highest bidder. There's a black market for cryptids that most people can't imagine. Private collectors, foreign governments, pharmaceutical companies interested in their unique biology. A living Bigfoot could fetch anywhere from $50 million to $250 million. Jack thought of the creature's eyes, the intelligence and fear he'd seen there. The idea of it caged, studied, exploited made him physically ill. You've been tracking it. Why didn't you protect it before it got hurt? We lost telemetry 4 days ago. These individuals are remarkably intelligent about removing tracking devices. ICH 247 disabled his subcutaneous tracker somehow. We've been searching ever since. Hayes leaned forward. Then last night, thermal satellites picked up the signature on your property. By the time we mobilized, he was gone again. But you saw him. You interacted with him. That makes you the only lead we have. So you want me to help you find him? Jack understood now why they'd come in such force. And then what? You capture him? Put another tracker in him? We protect him, Hayes said firmly. Mr. Morrison, I know how this looks. I know what you're thinking about government operations and secret programs. But this particular program exists for one reason only: conservation. These beings are dying out. Habitat loss, genetic bottlenecking, and now poachers who've somehow learned they exist. If we don't intervene, they'll be extinct within 2 generations. Jack wanted to believe her, but trust didn't come easily. Why should I believe anything you're saying? You invaded my property, threatened me, turned my home into a command center without permission. Because you're a scientist, Mr. Morrison. Or you were, before you retired here. Hayes pulled out another document, and Jack realized with a chill that it was his personnel file from his years as a wildlife biologist. Ph.D. in evolutionary biology from UC Berkeley. 15 years with the Forest Service, specializing in endangered species recovery. You worked on the California Condor program, the gray wolf reintroduction. You understand what's at stake when a species stands on the brink. She wasn't wrong. Jack had dedicated most of his professional life to conservation before Sarah's illness had pulled him away from that world. That was a long time ago. The knowledge doesn't expire. Neither does the conscience that drove you to that work. Hayes closed the file. Last night, you made a choice. You saw something extraordinary and frightening, and instead of running or attacking, you offered help. You gave water to a wounded creature that could have killed you with one blow. That tells me who you are, Mr. Morrison. Jack thought about the moment by the creek, the creature's eyes meeting his. the unspoken understanding that had passed between them. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Help us find him before the poachers do. They're in this area. We know that much. They have thermal equipment, tracking dogs, tranquilizer rifles. They're professionals, and they're motivated by more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes." Hayes's voice took on an urgent edge. The wilderness swallowed them whole, as Jack led the team deeper into the mountain terrain, his practiced eye reading signs that the federal agents would have walked past without a second glance. Dawn had broken cold and gray, the kind of morning that made the Montana peaks look like they were carved from iron. Behind him, a dozen people moved in careful formation, their boots crunching on frost-hardened ground, their breath forming clouds in the thin air. Jack paused at a cluster of serviceberry bushes, their branches bent at unnatural angles. He ran his fingers along the brakes, feeling the freshness of the damage. He came through here sometime after midnight, moving fast but not panicked. "See how the brakes are clean?" He was being careful despite the injury. Dr. Sarah Chen, the team's lead biologist, knelt beside him. She was younger than Jack had expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. The cognitive ability required for that kind of controlled movement while wounded and stressed suggests problem-solving capacity comparable to great apes, possibly higher. "Higher," Jack said quietly. "I saw it in his eyes. This isn't just an intelligent animal. There's someone in there." The team included an uncomfortable mix of personnel. Scientists like Dr. Chen, who viewed this as the discovery of a lifetime. Military contractors who treated it like a tactical operation. Hayes herself, who seemed to genuinely believe in the conservation mission, but carried the weight of government protocols. And Jack, who just wanted to make sure the creature he'd helped didn't end up in a cage or worse. As they climbed higher, Dr. Chen fell into step beside Jack. "Commander Hayes told you about the population estimates. 200 to 300 individuals across the entire continent. But what she might not have mentioned is that we've documented only 17 breeding females in the last decade. The genetic analysis we've managed from environmental DNA samples shows catastrophic inbreeding. This species is in a death spiral." Jack stopped to examine a partial footprint in soft earth near a seasonal stream. The print was massive, easily 18 inches long, showing a flexible foot structure more human than ape. "How long have you known they exist?" "The government?" "Since the 1950s officially. But there are records going back to the core of discovery, Lewis and Clark. Indigenous peoples have known for thousands of years, of course. They tried to tell us, but we called it mythology." Chen's voice carried genuine regret. "We could have been protecting them all this time. Instead, we denied their existence while their habitat disappeared around them." The trail led them through dense pine forest, where the canopy blocked most of the morning light. Jack found a sapling bent almost to the ground, its trunk showing stress marks, but not broken. "This is a trail marker. He's leaving signs for others of his kind. That means he's hoping to find them, hoping he's not alone in this territory." One of the military contractors, a hard-faced man named Reeves, spoke up. "Or he's leading us into a trap. These things are dangerous, Morrison. Don't anthropomorphize." Jack turned to face him. "I'm not anthropomorphizing. I'm recognizing intelligence when I see it. There's a difference between respecting a creature's capabilities and projecting human emotions onto it. Though after what I saw last night, I'm not sure where that line is anymore." Hayes called for a brief rest near a rocky outcropping. As the team dispersed to check equipment and hydrate, she approached Jack with a tablet displaying satellite imagery. "This is thermal data from 3 hours ago. We have 2 heat signatures moving through this area. She zoomed in on the screen. Neither matches our target's profile. We think it's the poachers. Jack studied the map, comparing it to the terrain around them. They're ahead of us, and they're moving toward that cave system. He pointed to a series of limestone formations visible on the ridge above them. If the creature is looking for shelter, that's where he'd go. It's defensible, has multiple exits, and there are underground springs for water. How do you know about underground springs? Chen asked. I've been exploring these mountains for 15 years. You learn the land when you live alone with it. Jack didn't mention the nights after Sarah died, when he'd wandered these peaks, half hoping to get lost and never find his way back. The wilderness had saved him then, in its own harsh way. Maybe now he could return the favor by saving something the wilderness was losing. They pushed on, moving faster now, with urgency driving them. Jack found more signs as they climbed, broken branches, disturbed leaf litter, and finally, a smear of blood on granite that made his chest tighten. The wound was worse than he'd thought. Infection could be setting in. Without proper treatment, even a creature that size could die from sepsis. The team made camp as twilight descended, unable to safely navigate the cave approaches in darkness. Jack sat apart from the others, eating an MRE without tasting it, watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. Sarah had loved nights like this. She'd made him promise, near the end, that he wouldn't disappear into grief, that he'd find something worth living for, beyond their life together. Hayes joined him, sitting on a nearby rock without invitation. You're thinking about your wife? How did you know? The file mentioned you retired after she passed, and I recognized the look. I lost someone too, a long time ago. She was quiet for a moment. This matters. What we're doing here. Not just for the creature, but for what it represents. Proof that the world still holds mysteries. That there are still things worth protecting even when it's difficult. Even when it's expensive. Even when most people will never know the truth. Jack thought about the creature's eyes. The moment of connection by the creek. Tomorrow, when we find him, I go in alone. He knows me. He trusted me once. A whole team will terrify him. That's not protocol. Protocol didn't save him from getting wounded. Protocol didn't bring him water when he was dying of thirst. Jack met her gaze steadily. You want my help? That's the condition. Hayes considered this, then nodded slowly. Alone. But we'll be right outside, ready to intervene if things go wrong. As Jack lay in his sleeping bag that night, listening to the mountain silence broken only by wind through pines, he thought about the cave system waiting above them. Somewhere in that darkness, a creature unlike anything science officially acknowledged was hiding, wounded and alone. And tomorrow, Jack would have to earn that trust again, knowing that everything depended on whether one frightened being would remember one small act of kindness. In a world that had given it every reason to fear, the cave entrance yawned before Jack like an open mouth, dark and forbidding in the early morning light. He stood at the threshold, medical pack slung over his shoulder, flashlight in hand, feeling the weight of every eye behind him. Hayes and her team waited 30 yards back, weapons ready but lowered, their tension palpable in the mountain air. Jack took a breath and stepped into the darkness. The temperature dropped immediately, the cave exhaling cold, mineral-scented air that spoke of depths unexplored by sunlight. His flashlight beam cut through the blackness, revealing limestone walls slick with moisture, formations that had taken millennia to form. The floor sloped downward, treacherous with loose stones that clattered away into echoing silence when his boots disturbed them. He moved carefully, listening for any sound beyond his own breathing and heartbeat. The cave system branched and twisted, passages leading off into deeper darkness. But Jack followed the signs he'd learned to read. Disturbed sediment, a tuft of reddish-brown hair caught on a rock projection, and finally, drops of blood that glistened in his flashlight beam, leading him downward into the mountain's heart. The passage narrowed, forcing him to turn sideways, then opened suddenly into a chamber large enough to stand upright. Jack swept his light across the space and froze. The creature sat against the far wall, massive form hunched in obvious pain. The wounded leg was extended, and even from 20 feet away, Jack could see the inflammation, the angry red streaks radiating from the gash. Infection, just as he'd feared. The Bigfoot's eyes caught the light, reflecting it back with an amber glow, and Jack saw recognition there, but also wariness and suffering. "It's okay," Jack said softly, keeping his voice low and calm. "I brought help. I brought what you need." He lowered himself to sit cross-legged on the cave floor, making himself smaller, less threatening. Slowly, he opened the medical pack and began removing items, setting them on the stone between them. Antiseptic, antibiotics, clean bandages, water bottles, dried fruit and jerky. An offering, a promise. The creature watched every movement with intelligent eyes. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by water dripping somewhere deeper in the cave system. Then, with obvious effort and pain, the Bigfoot shifted position, extending the wounded leg slightly toward Jack. Permission, trust remembered. Jack moved forward on his knees, keeping his movements slow and predictable. The wound was worse than he'd initially treated, the gash deep and now showing clear signs of infection. He'd need to clean it thoroughly, and it would hurt. He met the creature's eyes, trying to communicate what was coming, and saw something that made his breath catch. Understanding. The Bigfoot knew this would be painful, but necessary. Working as gently as possible, Jack cleaned the wound with antiseptic. The creature tensed, muscles rippling beneath the thick hair covering its body. But it didn't pull away or lash out. Jack talked while he worked, his voice a steady stream of reassurance, explaining what he was doing even though he didn't know how much the creature understood. Maybe the tone mattered more than the words. As he applied antibiotic ointment and began wrapping the wound with clean bandages, Jack's flashlight illuminated the chamber walls more fully. He paused, his hands stilling on the bandage, as he truly saw what surrounded them. The walls were covered in paintings. Not random marks or accidental stains, but deliberate images rendered in what looked like charcoal, ochre, and other natural pigments. Jack's scientific mind reeled as he recognized the style, similar to Paleolithic cave art he'd seen in textbooks, but different, unique. The paintings showed figures that were unmistakably Bigfoot, some alone, others in groups. There were hunting scenes, gathering scenes, what looked like family groups with smaller figures that must be young. But there was more. Images of other animals, now extinct, mammoths, dire wolves, giant ground sloths. These paintings were ancient, possibly thousands of years old, and interspersed among them were fresher marks, newer paintings showing the same subjects, but in more recent times. This wasn't just art, it was history. A visual record of a people, a culture, stretching back into deep time. Jack finished bandaging the wound with trembling hands, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he was seeing. This wasn't just a rare animal hiding in the wilderness. This was evidence of a parallel intelligence, a species that had developed culture, art, and historical consciousness alongside humanity, but had chosen or been forced to remain hidden. The creature watched him staring at the walls. Then, with surprising grace despite its injury, it rose and moved to the nearest painting. A large image showing a group of Bigfoot figures standing among what looked like early humans. The creature placed one massive hand on the painting, fingers splayed, and looked back at Jack. The message was clear. We were here. We have always been here. This is our story. Jack stood slowly, approaching the wall with reverence. He reached out, but stopped short of touching the ancient pigments. "How many of you are left?" he whispered, though he knew the creature couldn't answer in words. The Bigfoot moved to another section of wall, where newer paintings showed fewer and fewer figures. The visual narrative was heartbreaking. A dwindling population, families separated, lone individuals wandering through forests that grew smaller with each generation. The most recent paintings showed only scattered single figures, isolated and searching. Jack felt tears burning in his eyes. This creature wasn't just wounded and alone now. His entire species was wounded and alone, disappearing from a world that no longer had room for mysteries, for beings who wanted only to exist in peace away from human notice. The Bigfoot returned to his sitting position, movements careful around the newly bandaged wound. He reached for the water bottle Jack had brought, drank deeply, then picked up some of the dried fruit and ate it slowly. Jack sat down again, his back against the painted wall, and they remained there in silence. Two beings from different worlds, sharing a moment of profound understanding in the darkness beneath the mountain. The profound silence of the cave shattered as echoes of voices and scraping metal reverberated through the stone passages. Jack's head snapped toward the sound, his body tensing instantly. The Bigfoot heard it too, his entire frame going rigid, eyes widening with unmistakable fear. These weren't the careful, measured movements of Hayes and her federal team. These were the sounds of people who didn't care about stealth or preservation. Poachers. Jack scrambled to his feet, his mind racing through possibilities. The cave system must have multiple entrances, and somehow these criminals had found another way in. The creature rose beside him, favoring his injured leg, a low rumble building in his chest that Jack felt more than heard. It wasn't aggression, it was terror. "Easy," Jack whispered, though his own heart hammered against his ribs. "Stay behind me." The absurdity of the statement hit him even as he said it. What could he possibly do against armed poachers? This being could probably tear a man in half if necessary. Yet here Jack stood, positioning himself as protector. But the creature's wound, the infection, the exhaustion, he was vulnerable, and they both knew it. Light beams cut through the darkness from a passage Jack hadn't noticed before, harsh and probing. Voices grew louder, speaking in clipped professional tones that made Jack's blood run cold. These weren't amateurs. "Thermal signature is strong here. We're close. Remember, tranquilizers only. The buyer wants it alive and undamaged." Jack's scientific mind cataloged the implications even as fear flooded his system. International trafficking, exotic animal black markets, wealthy collectors who saw intelligent beings as trophies. The creature behind him wasn't a person to these men. He was a commodity worth millions. The first poacher emerged into the chamber, tactical gear and night vision equipment, making him look like something from a military operation. His weapon came up immediately. Not a rifle, but a tranquilizer gun, just as threatening. Two more men followed, spreading out with practiced efficiency. "Well, well," the lead poacher said, his accent vaguely Eastern European. "The American government's pet tracker. We've been monitoring their radio chatter. You made this almost too easy, old man." Jack didn't respond, didn't move. His mind spun through scenarios, all of them ending badly. The creature pressed closer behind him, and Jack could feel the rapid beating of his massive heart through the contact. "Step aside," another poacher ordered, his tranquilizer gun trained on the Bigfoot. "This doesn't concern you. Walk away, and you live." Simple choice. "No." The word came out steadier than Jack felt. "You're not taking him." The lead poacher laughed, a cold sound that echoed off the painted walls. "Him? You've anthropomorphized an animal. How touching. Last chance, old man. We have no interest in witnesses, but we'll make an exception if you move now." Jack's hands clenched at his sides. Behind him, the creature shifted, and Jack sensed the internal struggle. The instinct to flee, warring with something else. Something that kept him from abandoning the human who had shown him kindness. The poacher's finger moved toward the trigger. The gunshot that rang out didn't come from a tranquilizer. It came from the passage Jack had entered through, and it struck the stone wall near the lead poacher's head with a spray of sparks and rock fragments. Everyone froze. "Federal agents! Drop your weapons!" Hayes's voice carried absolute authority as she emerged with a tactical team, real weapons drawn and ready. The cave chamber suddenly filled with armed personnel, red laser sights painting the poachers from multiple angles. But the poachers were professionals. Instead of surrendering, they scattered, using the cave's natural pillars and formations for cover. One fired his tranquilizer gun wildly in the direction of the Bigfoot. Jack saw the dart's trajectory, saw where it would strike the creature's exposed neck, and moved without thinking. The dart hit Jack in the shoulder, the impact like being punched. Chemical fire spread instantly through his upper body, his legs going weak. He heard the creature's bellow of distress, felt massive hands catch him as he fell. The world tilted sickeningly. Chaos erupted. More gunfire, shouts, the sound of bodies hitting stone. Jack's vision blurred, the tranquilizer designed for an 8-foot, 800-pound creature overwhelming his system. Through the haze, he felt himself being lowered carefully to the ground, felt the creature's hands, gentle despite their size, arranging him into a safe position. The Bigfoot could run now. The distraction was perfect, the passages open, escape possible. Jack tried to speak, to tell him to go, to save himself, but his tongue wouldn't cooperate. His eyes, fighting to stay open, saw the creature look toward the dark passages, saw the calculation in those intelligent eyes. Then the Bigfoot did something that would change everything. He stayed. More than that, he positioned himself over Jack's prone form, shielding him with his own body, that same protective instinct Jack had shown now reflected back. The creature's eyes, meeting Hayes's across the chamber, held no aggression, only desperate plea. Help him. Hayes saw it. Jack, consciousness fading, watched her face transform as she witnessed undeniable proof of what this being truly was. Not an animal, not a specimen. A person, capable of compassion, sacrifice, and love. "Stand down," Hayes commanded her team. "Secure the poachers only. Nobody touches the creature." The tactical operation shifted focus. Poachers were subdued with efficient brutality, their equipment confiscated, their bodies forced against the cave walls in restraints. One tried to fight and was quickly overwhelmed. Within minutes, all three were secured. Jack felt the creature's hand on his face, surprisingly gentle. Through dimming vision, he saw the Bigfoot reach for one of the water bottles Jack had brought, saw him carefully tilt water to Jack's lips, mimicking exactly what Jack had done for him that first night by the creek. The parallel wasn't lost on anyone present. Hayes approached slowly, hands visible and empty, speaking in a calm, measured tone. "We're here to help, both of you. I promise." The creature watched Hayes with those impossibly intelligent eyes, weighing her words, her tone, her body language. Jack, fighting the tranquilizer's pull, saw the moment of decision, the Bigfoot slowly stepping back, allowing the federal team access while remaining close enough to intervene if needed. Medical personnel rushed forward, checking Jack's vitals, administering counteragents to slow the drug's effect. The creature observed every movement, learning, understanding. When a medic's hand moved too quickly near Jack's injured shoulder, a low, warning rumble echoed through the cave. The medic froze, then deliberately slowed his movements, showing his intentions. The Bigfoot's rumble ceased. Hayes knelt beside Jack, her voice cutting through his fog. "You took a dart meant for him. Why?" Jack's words came slowly, slurred but determined. "Same reason. He stayed for me. Because it's right." Something shifted in Hayes' expression, years of protocol and procedure cracking under the weight of witnessed truth. She stood, addressing her entire team. "New operational parameters. This location is now a protected site. The creature is under federal conservation protection, not containment. Anyone who disagrees can explain themselves to the director, after I explain what I saw here today." The poachers, restrained against the cave wall, began shouting protests and threats. Hayes silenced them with a look that could freeze fire. "You're facing federal charges for attempted trafficking of an endangered sentient being, weapons violations on protected land, and assault on a federal contractor. The buyers you work for are already being rounded up. Your operation is finished." As the tranquilizer's effect gradually lessened with medical intervention, Jack's awareness sharpened. He watched Hayes photograph the cave paintings with reverence, saw her team's faces transform from hunters to protectors. The creature remained close, occasionally touching Jack's arm as if to reassure himself that the human who'd shown him kindness was recovering. Hours later, as dawn broke over Montana's wilderness, Jack sat wrapped in blankets outside the cave entrance while federal personnel established a perimeter. The Bigfoot had retreated deeper into the cave system, but hadn't fled entirely. Hayes sat beside Jack, tablet in hand, showing him preliminary plans. "We're designating this entire area as a classified wildlife preserve," she explained. "Your ranch sits at the center. We need someone who understands both the land and the species to manage it. Someone he trusts." Jack looked at the screen, seeing boundaries drawn around thousands of acres, protection protocols, research guidelines focused on observation rather than interference. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a purpose." Hayes met his eyes. "Your background in wildlife biology, your connection to this creature, your ethical compass. We need all of it. This isn't just about one Bigfoot. We've had credible sightings in 6 other locations. If we handle this right, we might save an entire species from extinction." Jack thought of Sarah, of her final words encouraging him to find meaning beyond grief. This felt like her hand guiding him, pushing him toward something larger than his pain. What about the cave paintings, the historical evidence? Studied in situ by anthropologists with clearance and conscience. No removal, no exploitation. This site proves these beings have culture, history, intelligence that rivals our own. That changes everything about how we approach them. Hayes paused, her voice softening. "What you did in there, taking that dart, my team saw it. He saw it. Then he stayed to protect you, brought you water, showed more humanity than most humans I know. That's not something we can ignore or contain. That's something we have to honor." Over the following weeks, Jack's ranch transformed into something unprecedented. Federal contractors built concealed monitoring stations, established protected corridors, created a research facility disguised as ranch buildings. Scientists arrived. Anthropologists, primatologists, linguists, all carefully vetted, all committed to protection over exploitation. The Bigfoot, his leg healing properly now, began occasional appearances. Never threatening, always cautious but present. Jack would leave food and medical supplies at the cave entrance, and they would be accepted. Sometimes, at dusk, Jack would see a massive silhouette on the ridge, watching. He'd raise his hand in greeting, and the gesture would be returned. The cave paintings revolutionized scientific understanding. Evidence of Bigfoot presence spanning 10,000 years, depicting interaction with indigenous peoples, showing a culture of oral history preserved in stone. Academic papers were written, classified, but circulated among select researchers, rewriting assumptions about North American prehistory. 3 months after the cave incident, Hayes returned with news. We've located 2 more groups, one in Washington, one in Northern California. Both are being protected using protocols we developed here. Your model is working. Jack stood on his porch, looking out over land that now served a purpose beyond his solitude. The grief that had defined him for 3 years hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something else. Legacy, protection, hope. Sarah had always believed in standing for what mattered, even when it was difficult, especially then. The sanctuary attracted no public attention. Officially, it didn't exist. But within conservation circles, whispered stories spread of a place where humanity had chosen protection over profit, where an impossible species found safety, where one man's simple act of kindness had changed government policy and scientific paradigm. As sunset painted the Montana sky in shades of amber and rose, Jack saw movement on the distant ridge. The Bigfoot stood there, silhouetted against the dying light, no longer wounded, no longer alone in his struggle for survival. For a long moment, 2 beings from different species regarded each other across the distance, connected by mutual respect and remembered compassion. Jack raised his hand slowly. The creature responded, that same deliberate gesture of acknowledgement and gratitude. Then he turned and disappeared into the forest that was now, finally, truly protected. Jack smiled, feeling Sarah's presence in the evening breeze, knowing she'd approve of the path he'd chosen. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved or captured or displayed. Some were meant to be protected, honored, allowed to exist in the wild spaces where wonder still lived. His ranch had become more than a refuge from grief. It had become a bridge between worlds, proof that kindness transcended species, that compassion could change everything. The unknown, Jack had learned, wasn't something to fear or exploit. It was something to protect, to respect, to let remain beautifully, necessarily mysterious.